million, 2 million, 3 million. Testing, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. That's working. Okay.
I appreciate that. When you get to be 87, people stand and applaud at the start because they're not sure whether you're going to be around at the end.
Testing. 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. Seems to be working. You can always hear that anyway. When I came down today, it's been 54 years since I drove down what was then the Highway 6, the Cornhusker Highway, to come to Lincoln to school. And even then, there was a lot of nostalgia attached with it because my father had attended the University of Nebraska in the 1920s. He was editor of the Daily Nebraskan, and one day a young woman from West Point, a student, came in to apply for a job as a reporter on the Daily Nebraskan, and my father not only hired her as a reporter, but he married her shortly thereafter. So both my parents attended here. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was here in the 1890s, and so a lot of good things have happened to me because of the University of Nebraska. I received a terrific education here. I was telling the dean the most valuable thing I learned here, but I learned a lot, but the most valuable was accounting, and we had a wonderful professor named Ray Dean. There may even be something named for him down here, isn't there? Yeah, he was, I'd been to the Wharton School, I went to Columbia Graduate School subsequently, and I took a lot of accounting courses, but by far the best instruction I received in accounting came from Ray Dean, and there's nothing more important. People ask me what they should take in business school, or even if they don't go to business school, what they need to know before getting in business, and I tell them, you have to understand accounting. It's the language. I mean, it's like being in a foreign country without knowing the language if you're in business and you don't understand accounting. So you want to get as comfortable with that as you are with the English language. It's made me a lot of money because I listened to what Ray Dean had to say 53 or 4 years ago, and have been able to understand what I was seeing on pieces of paper, what that told me about businesses, and the limitations of what it told me about businesses. But that's the way we invest. Yesterday I was in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we bought a company. We agreed to buy a company called Clayton Homes about a week ago. It's a big company in the manufactured home business. We agreed to pay $1.7 billion for it. I made that deal over the phone without ever meeting the people there, but I had seen enough through reading 10Ks, 10Qs, annual reports, but looking at figures, what they tell me in terms of the kind of people even running the place, the kind of accounting decisions they make and so on. I was able to make that $1.7 billion transactions over the phone. Yesterday was the first time I met the people, and their board of directors had actually approved the deal a week earlier. So it's, I couldn't have done that if I hadn't have, had a great time at Ray Dean's class 53 years ago. So if I'm going to tout one thing, aside from this particular leadership class, of course, if I'm going to tout one thing, I would tell you that get comfortable with it. It may not happen the first week or the first month in the class, but get very comfortable with accounting. So I run into CEOs periodically who really don't understand it. They try to bluff their way through, and you can see in their faces, they're frightened almost when somebody hands them a balance sheet or an income statement. They really don't know what it means, and they have to count on somebody else. And that's something you shouldn't count on. We make all our acquisition decisions ourselves. I mean, we don't call in consultants or anybody. We don't call in investment bankers, much to their disgust. No investment banking fees in the Clayton Homes deal, because it's my responsibility running Berkshire to understand enough about our acquisition decisions to make them based on the numbers that I see and what I see there. This course, however, is about leadership, And I'd like to talk just for a minute about that. And then I'd like to really talk about whatever's on your mind, and we'll get questions. But leadership obviously it's a very simple thing in concept. My job as the leader of Berkshire Hathaway is to have visions and goals for the company overall with a long time horizon attached to them, and then to get those goals accomplished through other people. That's what it's all about. I can't do it myself, so I have to know where I want us to get to. I have to see over the next mountain if possible, but then I have to get a lot of other people to look over that mountain with me and really do the job. I mean, they are the ones that get it accomplished. So it's getting things done through other people. Now, Berkshire is like many large corporations in certain ways, but it's really quite different in many ways. We have over 150,000 people now working for Berkshire Hathaway in dozens of companies throughout this country primarily, and even abroad a little bit. We have exactly 15.8 people in headquarters, and Deb Ray came down with me today, so we've only got 13.8 there today, and we're probably working just as well with those 13.8 as we would if Deb and I were in the office. But that's an unusual organization. I mean, we have dozens of operating managers, CEOs of their businesses, out there running them today, and they do it without any direction from the home office except for one very limited piece of direction that I give them, which I'll get to in a second. But we have these people, and they're an unusual group of people running these businesses because most of them have sold their businesses to us, and they're very, very wealthy. 3/4 of our managers do not need to work financially. They have no reason financially to work. Probably 3/4 of them are worth at least $50 million, and we have some that are worth in the billions. And yet these people jump out of bed every morning, and work, and they work weekends, and they love working. And why is that? And what's the key to that? Well, the key really is the same reason I keep working. I'm 72. I'm getting Social Security now, so I should be in Florida, pushing shuffleboard around or something of the sort. But I do what I can do. Anything in the world I want to do. But what I want to do is run Berkshire Hathaway. Now, why do I want to run it that way? There's a couple things. A, I get to paint my own painting. I go down there every day, and I feel like Michelangelo there, working on the Sistine Chapel or something. Nobody else may think it's a great painting, but I get to paint my own painting. I do not have people second guessing me. I do not have people saying, why don't you use a little more red paint than blue paint? Why don't you paint a seascape instead of a landscape? I get to do my own thing. It's a form of creativity. It's exactly like somebody feels it's a professional golfer or somebody feels it's a painter. They're not doing it for the money, primarily. They're doing it because they like doing something well, and that it happens to be down the route of their talents. And the second thing I like, frankly, is I like applause. I like appreciation. So I like having shareholders who feel good about what I've done. I mean, I have a 96-year-old aunt, and her husband went to the University of Nebraska too, and she is. She has all her money in Berkshire Hathaway, and she counts on me. And she's out in Palm Springs now, and her whole net worth is in Berkshire. And I've got cousins, and I've got everybody in our family has got all their money in Berkshire. And so those people are counting on me, and that's kind of fun to have something where you can actually deliver for other people and change their lives in positive ways. As a matter of fact, we had a couple that nobody had ever heard of up until a few years ago, the Othmers in New York. They came from Omaha. Don Othmer went to Central High. Mitt Othmer, not sure which high school she went to in Omaha, probably South High. They left $750 million when they died. Nobody had ever heard of them. And I think a substantial portion, went right here to the University of Nebraska. It was probably a total surprise to the university when they got, I don't know, you probably got 150 million or so. Yeah. Yeah, well, you should thank the Othmers, but nevertheless, you see the money, you see good things happening out of it. So it's fun. I mean, it's, it beats playing golf every day or something of the sort. So I say, if that's what turns me on, What's going to turn on these managers that are out there running things like Clayton Homes, or we've got a company, Flight Safety, that trains more pilots than anybody in the world. Flight Safety is run by an 85-year-old man, Al Yulshi. Al started the company with $10,000 in 1951. It now trains 4 or 5 times as many pilots, as non-military pilots, as anybody in the world. And he is there at 85, and it's a matter of public record. He's got $1 billion worth of Berkshire shares. He works 7 days a week. He loves it. And he loves it for the same reason that I love what I do. He gets to do it his way. He buys these big simulators that you train pilots in. He doesn't have to check with me as to whether to spend $15 million for a simulator. He doesn't ask me. He knows so much more about it than I do. Why in the world would he ask me? Well, I can't tell what kind of a plane I'm in, when I'm flying around. And Al is spending a couple $100 million a year on simulators, spending Berkshire Hathaway money, and he never checks with Omaha. He's never had to come to Omaha for any kind of meetings. He runs his own business, and that's what he loves in life. And I let him do it. I mean, that's my contribution to it, is really turning loose his energies. And, they were properly directed before we bought the company 7 or 8 years ago. Why should I think that, he couldn't keep running it after that? And like I say, at 85, he's still running it. The second thing that our managers like, in addition to this painting their own painting, is they too love applause. I mean, I try to be, I report in my annual report accurately what they have accomplished, but they accomplished a lot. You heard Susan Jock, I think, some weeks ago here. Susan came to Borsheim's, and she was making $4 an hour. $4 an hour. And at age, before she was 40, she became CEO of the second largest independent jewelry operation in the United States, from $4 an hour. But it's talent, and Susan knows more about, I don't know anything about jewelry, you could hand me a phony diamond or a real diamond, I couldn't tell the difference. But if I started telling Susan what to order in the way of jewelry, or if I started telling her what kind of terms to extend to customers or who to hire or anything like that, she doesn't need that in life. She really owns Borsheim's. We have the stock certificate, we get the profits. We get accustomed to. But it's her baby. It's her baby. She decides, everything about that place. And so it's her creation. And that feeling of ownership is really extraordinary, and it's so much better. I mean, it's the way I like to work, and it's the way, Susan Jock likes to work. It's the way Al Yoshi likes to work. And Susan, like anybody else in this world, loves being appreciated. I mean, there'd be something wrong with her if she didn't. And the truth is, nobody appreciates her more than I do. I mean, she is a talent. And we are lucky to have her, and we're lucky to have all of these other managers. So leadership at Berkshire really consists of taking a bunch of people who, in a baseball analogy, would be 400 hitters, and just handing them the bat and just telling them to get up their plate and take a big swing. There's very little to it beyond that. One thing I do is I send them a letter. We don't have meetings in Omaha. Some of our managers, there aren't any meetings, and there's no catechism or anything else. Once every 2 years, I send them a letter. This is it. Roughly one and a half pages or so. The only instruction they get from us. They don't send budgets to us. We don't care about that. Some of the companies use budgets, some don't use budgets. We adjust to them. Some of the managers I talk to a couple times a week because they like to talk frequently. Some of them I talk to literally once a year because they don't like to talk to me. And whatever, it's up to them. I adapt to them. The only thing I tell them, and this letter, which went out January 20th, 2003, it says it's been 2.5 years since my last memo. Now, how many big companies do you have the managers out there? It's been 2.5 years since they've heard from the home office. It's been 2.5 years since my last memo. Here are a couple things to keep in mind. And number one, and this is number one every time. This doesn't change. It won't change 2 years from now or 4 years from now or 6 years from now. Number one, we can afford to lose money, even a lot of money. We cannot afford to lose reputation, even a shred of reputation. Let's be sure that everything we do in business can be reported on the front page of a national newspaper in an article written by an unfriendly but intelligent reporter. In many areas, including acquisitions, Berkshire's results have benefited from its reputation, and we don't want to do anything that in any way can tarnish it. Last year, Berkshire was ranked by Fortune as the 4th most admired company in the world. This year, we were 3rd in the United States. They just published it. It took us 37 years to get there, but we could lose it in 37 minutes. And that's the message. I mean, we can lose money. It does, nicer to make money, but we'll figure out ways to make money. But we can't lose a shred of reputation, because you don't get it back. And you can. I said 37 minutes, but you can lose it a lot faster than that. You can lose it in 5 minutes. And in fact, I was talking to Bruce coming in, and he did some work around Salomon Brothers, and I went back there 11 years ago because this firm, which had the 2nd largest balance sheet in the United States at that time. It was a preeminent firm on Wall Street. John Goodfriend, who ran it, had his picture on the front of Business Week as the king of Wall Street. And in late in April 1991, he made a fateful decision. It was reported to him that an employee down the line had flim-flammed the U.S. Treasury, had broken some rules, tried to play games with him. And John did not report that fact to the Treasury or to the Federal Reserve or to the SEC or to anybody else. He didn't do anything wrong himself, but he got behind the curve. He didn't report it. The president of the company, Tommy Strauss, didn't report it. If you saw that Katie Couric show on Sunday night on the Central Park Jogger, Tom Strauss was on there, but Tom Strauss ended up losing he was president of Salomon Brothers. John was chairman, John Goodfriend. They didn't do anything. They dawdled. And after a few weeks, the same guy that had committed the terrible acts earlier, on May 15th, he did the same thing again at a Treasury auction. And now they were in this terrible pickle because they had known about this on about April 28th, that this guy was a bad actor, and they hadn't done anything. And now on May 15th, he does the same thing again. And now if they go, they start feeling if they go and talk about it, that people will say, well, why weren't you in here before? So they just kept trying to shove it out of their mind and do other things. And it came within inches of destroying the firm. It destroyed their careers. I mean, John Goodfriend had spent 30 years in Wall Street and had a fine reputation. The king of Wall Street was brought down by one simple act of omission. All he had to do was pick up the phone. Jerry Corrigan was head of the New York Fed. He had to pick up the phone and say, Jerry, you won't believe this, but this crazy guy in our Treasury Department, a fellow named Mosier, has just done this thing, and I'm terribly embarrassed, and what can we do to make it right? I mean, and Jerry Corrigan, being Jerry Corrigan, would have turned red in the face and gotten very mad and issued a lot of language I couldn't repeat here, but in the end he would have said, thanks for calling and telling us about it immediately, and we'll slap a fine on you or do whatever is appropriate. And the next day, the firm would have gone on fine. But John Goodfriend, actually, a perfectly okay guy, but he didn't act when it counted. And Tommy Strauss, who was number 2, the same way. And later on, they were fined and in a certain way kicked out of the securities industry. And Salomon barely survived. 8,000 employees around the world had their future in real jeopardy because of that single act. So just apply the newspaper test. That's what I tell our managers. I could have a 1,000-page book of ethics. I could have all kinds of rules and hundreds of, but in the end, just all you got to do is think about, do you really want what you're doing put on the front page of the paper tomorrow to be read by your parents, by your spouse, by your kids, by your neighbors, by your coworkers? And if you're embarrassed about it, just forget about it. You're all going to do well financially. The nice thing about it is, you live in America in the year 2003. You don't live in Bangladesh. You don't live in America, of 1790 when it would. You live in a society which has a GDP of over 10 trillion, and you can just pick up the crumbs and you're going to do great. You've all got the qualities. It takes 3 qualities essentially to do well, and extremely well actually in this country. It takes intelligence, it takes energy, and it takes integrity. Now, everybody in this room has the requisite intelligence. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. I mean, it doesn't take 180 IQs, although I'm sure you all have those. But it takes reasonable intelligence. You're getting a great education. You've got the energy. That's why you've shown up in school. And it takes integrity. And I say, if you don't have integrity, we don't want to hire somebody that's got intelligence and energy if they don't have integrity. We'd rather hire somebody that's dumb and lazy if they don't have integrity, because they probably will never get around to cheating us or doing something of the sort. Last thing in the world I want is somebody that's lacks. Mosher had intelligence and energy at Solomon. He was head of the government bond trading thing, and he had lots of intelligence and he had lots of energy, and he went to jail, and he almost brought down the firm. And integrity is absolutely an option. You may not be able to throw a football 60 yards. And you may not be able to run the 100 in 9.8. You may not be able to sink 3-pointers but you can choose where you stand on the integrity scale. You weren't born wired one way or the other. That is an absolute choice you make. And the heroes I've had in life have been the people that I felt stood out in that respect. My number one hero was my dad, but I've had other heroes, Tom Murphy, Ben Graham, people like that. And the reason I admired them was not because they were the smartest people in the world, although they were plenty smart. And it wasn't because they made the most money. That meant nothing. It's really because I felt they were the classiest people that I ever met in my life. I mean, I saw them behave over year after year after year in a way that I could write their story on the front page of any newspaper, and even in an unfriendly tone, and I could not do anything that would embarrass them in the least. They behaved extraordinarily well. And having the right heroes, is terribly important. You tell me who a 10-year-old's heroes are, and I can give you a pretty good prediction about how they're going to turn out. You want to choose your heroes very carefully, because you're going to look like them at some point, and you're lucky if you've got the right ones. I'll give you an aside, and then we'll get on to your questions. But it's something, you're not parents yet, most of you. But when you're a parent, you are the natural hero of your child. You're this great big thing, or there's two of you great big things, and there's a little tiny child dependent on you. Everything. You are the natural hero, and anything they get to school, subsequently, or anything else, they're going to be shaped more by what they see in this behavior of yours toward them than anything that will impact them later in their lives. And if they want you to be the hero, you can destroy that, of course, and you've seen it done many, many times. But actually, if the parents are proper heroes, the child is about 90% of the way home. And you're lucky if you've had parents like that. And you can be that to your children, or you can be something else. And you're shaping that person. It's nice to learn accounting when you get to Nebraska, but the behavior model that you take on is incredibly important. Let's talk about what's on your mind now.
It's great to be with this group. It was 8 years ago. I just turned 80. I never really talked to any graduation groups or anything of the sort. It was not on my bucket list particularly. And then I got invited to go to LaGuardia, to the LaGuardia Community College. And I met a truly remarkable group. Whether it was male, female, Hispanic, African American, whatever it might be, these people had one thing in common. They knew they had it in themselves. They knew they could be something beyond where they were. They were willing to put their time, their energies to better themselves. And behind them, as I saw when I got to the graduation on September 22nd, frequently they had parents who were crying as they received their children received the degrees. They had spouses, they had siblings. It was one of the great experiences of my life. And at that point, I was hooked. So I went to New Orleans, I went to Chicago, I went to Detroit, I went to Cleveland, I went to Baltimore. And I met the most remarkable group of people. And if you'd told me that 22 or 2,300 out of those people would be here just 8 years later, having proven to yourself what you really could do with more skills, it's just remarkable. So I would like to just tell you a couple of short stories, and we'll draw maybe a couple of lessons from them. As I came in, Mike Bloomberg was talking, and he talked about immigrants, and I echo his remarks. But I would like to tell you of two women that each sold a business to Berkshire Hathaway, to me actually, for many, many, many millions of dollars. Both of them started with $2,500. By a coincidence, it was the exact same amount. It was everything they had in the world. And one of them was a woman who landed in Seattle in 1917, couldn't speak a word of English, had a tag around her neck. The tag said, Fort Dodge, Iowa. The Red Cross got her to Fort Dodge, where she was reunited with her husband, who had come to the country a couple of years earlier. And she lived in Fort Dodge for 2 years, and as she put it, she felt like a dummy. She couldn't pick up the language. She couldn't learn a word. And so she and her husband decided to move to Omaha. So they came to Omaha in 1919, and there she found a small colony of Russian Jews, so she started feeling more at home. And then as her oldest daughter went to school, she would come home, this daughter, Frances, and she would teach her mother the words she'd learned in school that day. And this woman, Rose Blumpkin, spent 20 years saving money, bringing first her siblings over, her mother and father, $50 at a time. She sold used clothing to do it. She had 4 children during this period. And by 1937, after 20 years, she'd saved $2,500. She went to Chicago, and she bought what she could of furniture. Her dream had always been to open a furniture store. And this woman who had never gone to school one day in her life, with $2,500, but with the same spirit that the people in this room had about having a dream and working to accomplish that dream, she built a business which she sold to me in 1983 for $60 million approximately, and which did $1.5 billion worth of business last year. The 4th generation is working in that business. This woman, Rose Blumpkin, she worked for me until she was 103. And then she retired, and she died the next year, which is a lesson to all of Berkshire's managers that premature retirement, you can't tell what's going to happen. But Mrs. B, with her $2,500, one further fact about her: she could not read or write. And she went into a furniture business, and she didn't bring anything unique in furniture, but she brought a determination to succeed. She knew she could outwork anyone else. She knew she cared about her customers. She worked at very low gross margins, but she built this incredible business. And I saw one other woman who did a similar thing with $2,500, and I paid her hundreds of millions of dollars for her business. So I decided to go to the source and get these people before, I don't want you guys coming around to me asking me hundreds of millions of dollars. I'd like to join in with you much earlier. So I've followed this group, and today I'd like to tell you about one other small business person. This person, I went to buy his business from him, and he turned me down, which was very wise. But this was a fellow who was born about 8 years before I was. He was born in 1922, He was we'll call him Jack, lived in the Midwest. He was a pretty good athlete, didn't like school much. And I'm going to tell you one thing early in the story. Maybe you can figure out who the guy was. The company he built hires more college graduates each year than any other company in the United States. And this fellow, who was destined for this but did not know it, Jack, went to college for a year and then dropped out. He really wasn't that interested in school. And the year he dropped out was 1941. And when the United States became under attack, he went down to the Army Air Force recruiting station, volunteered, and they turned him down because he had hay fever. So he went over to the Navy and again volunteered, and they took him. They put him on an aircraft carrier. He flew small flight airplanes during World War II, got 2 distinguished flying crosses from the Navy, and then he came back to the Midwest. So now we've got a young guy. Probably by this time he would be 23 or 24 years old. And the interesting thing is, he got back to the Midwest, and he actually kind of went from one job to another for a short period of, or not such a short period of time. And he finally became a used car salesman at a Cadillac dealership in St. Louis, Missouri. And at age 35, having moved up in the organization, the sales organization, he said to his boss, could I go into car leasing business with you? The boss said, well, if you'll cut your salary in half and you'll come up with, I think it was $25,000, which he borrowed, we can become partners in a car leasing company. So my friend Jack started at age 35 in the car leasing business. And he had 7 cars. It was pretty slow. In fact, one of the things he did was whenever the phone rang, he let it ring 3 or 4 times so people would think that he was very busy answering other phones. And of course, it was the only call he was going to get all day. So his first venture was okay, but it wasn't really going to go anyplace. And there's a lesson in this for all of us. At age 40, he decided, with 17 vehicles, 17 cars, he was going to go into competition in the rent-a-car business. So now he's taking on Hertz and Avis and National and people like that who have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cars. And he's got 17 cars. And his cars aren't any different than theirs. I mean, he's buying them from General Motors or Ford or Chrysler. And he can't get the airport locations. Those companies have them all sold up. But he was determined that he would basically offer the customer, can't offer him a different car, but he can offer them friendlier service than they've ever seen. And so he started a company. He named it after the battleship that he'd flown from in the Pacific, which was the USS Enterprise. And he died about a year and a half ago. But when he died, his rent-a-car company, starting with those 17 cars, was worth more than Hertz and Avis and all the rest of the rental cars put together. The man's name was Jack Taylor, and his son, Andy Taylor, is a good friend of mine, runs the business now. A grandchild is in the business. There'll probably be a 4th generation along the line. So this man, in the United States, he didn't invent artificial intelligence. You know, he didn't do anything that, just like Mrs. B selling furniture, I mean, that any one of us could have entered those businesses. But he lived by the by the creed, basically, of delighting his customers and working with people and establishing the relationship with them so that they in turn would want to delight the customers. He couldn't go out there and take care of every rental car possibility, but he learned how to project himself and his attitude toward his fellow man and his desire, to make a friend out of every customer. He managed to take very ordinary cars and turn them into this extraordinary business from virtually nothing. And it illustrates several points. One is, you don't necessarily get it right exactly right the first time. I mean, the car leasing business, basically you were competing on the cost of money to finance cars. And it's very hard to delight a customer when you just give them the car and tell them to send you a monthly check for 5 years and you'll be back at that time. So his talents were being wasted basically in that business. But at the age of 40, with all of that experience behind him, he found the golden key, and he took a very ordinary business and turned it into an absolutely extraordinary operation. And just like Mrs. B or Rose Blumpkin did with furniture. And he didn't worry about whether the Federal Reserve was going to tighten or ease. He didn't worry about whether the stock market was up or down yesterday. He didn't worry about the things he couldn't change, but he did focus on the one thing he could change, and that was the customer's experience. And I have seen the one that got away, Enterprise. I went down to Florida and tried to talk him into selling to Berkshire, and he was smart enough not to do it. Probably the value of the company has quadrupled since I made that visit. But he was smart enough to see that he would find that business. Henry Ford, as you may know, failed twice before he started the Ford Motor Company in 1903. I mean, the test isn't whether you get the greatest business idea in the world the first time out. The test is whether you keep learning as you go along what your strengths are and what you can do for your customers, what you can bring especially to the party. And to do that, you need the education that I know you've received through 10,000 small businesses, but you need a genuine desire day in, day out to delight the customer. I've never seen a business, and I've seen a lot of businesses, but I've never seen one that delights the customer that doesn't succeed. I mean, what you want is that customer the next day when they think, do I want to rent a car or do I want to buy some furniture? What goes through their mind? It's the place where they've had a great experience. I don't know what I paid for this tie. Actually, probably if somebody gave it to me, but for the purposes of this speech, I will say I have no idea. But or the shirt I'm wearing, or this, but I do know I will remember how I was treated when I bought it. I mean, you long forget about the price, but you never forget whether you had a good experience or a poor experience with the purchase experience. And you'll have a hard time finding a person that's had a wonderful experience, a delighted experience in purchasing anything that isn't going to come back. And similarly, if the memory is of rudeness, indifference, whatever it may be, they're never going to come back. And as a small business owner, and as you grow, you have to not only be able to project that interest in people's well-being, in delighting them yourself, but you have to do it through other people. And you won't be able to do it through people who themselves do not feel they're being fairly treated, that their views aren't appropriately considered. So you really do have to learn to multiply yourself through other people. And I advise the young people that come to Omaha. We have a number of classes. The key is to certainly, in terms of your personal life, the most important decision you'll make is the spouse that most of you will likely have. And it's very important to surround yourself with people that are better than you are. You are going to move in the direction of the people you associate with. So you constantly. I've been enormously lucky in that respect. I mean, I've just had teachers and friends and a spouse that really was a better person than I was, and I had enough sense to learn from these people that life went better if you behave better yourself. It took a while. So I advise you to seek out, as your partner in business, your partner in life, whatever it may be, look for the people that actually are examples to you, rather than somebody that you think you need to straighten out yourself. And simple rules like that, delighting customers, working through other people, associating with people that will cause you to move in a better path than you might otherwise have, they will take you so far in life that it's hard to believe. I mean, they took Rose Blumpkin without being able to speak a word of English, and couldn't read or write, and they took her to what is now a $1.5 billion business. And incidentally, there's been no money put in it since the $2,500. That's been the total capital paid into the Nebraska Furniture Mart. And I think if you looked at Enterprise, I don't know their books the same way, but my guess is that very little equity capital has been added to Enterprise over the years. The business built on itself. So I want to tell you, I admire this group enormously. When I met Dr. Mello's class on September 22nd, 8 years ago, I was thrilled. And I admire people that are doing what you have done. Working hard at your job at the same time, you took on an added really a lot of hard work to further your skills. 99% graduate. I mean, that's a mind-blowing statistic. And I'm looking at 2,200 people here who I admire. I'm cheering for you, and I can tell you the best is yet to come. Thank you.
I'd like to talk to you about your financial future, and I hope those figures become applicable to all of you as we go along. And I'd like to start by posing a problem for you. And incidentally, I'm just going to talk for a couple minutes, and we'll do Q&A, because what we want to do is talk about what's on your mind. But I'd like you to think about this for just a second. If, as we walked out of here today, I said I would like to buy 10% of your financial future, I was going to write you a check today, and from this day forth, you were going to give me 10% of everything you earned. How much would you want to charge me for that? I'm going to buy 1/10 of you. And I may take the low bid, incidentally, so be careful what you write down. Well, I think if you thought about that a little while, you can contemplate that for a few minutes. You're going to get a check from me today, and you can do anything you want with the money, but from this day forth, you have to give me 10% of what you earn. I think it would be very foolish of you, any of you, if you asked for less than, say, $50,000. Now, it's going to be a few years before you're out earning money, and so I've got a few years of dead money there. But then I would start getting this royalty on you as you went along. So I really think that if you thought about it, most of you would want a fair amount more than that, and I think you'd be right. Fortunately, I didn't make this deal with anybody when I started out, so nobody's got a 10% royalty on me. But I think that 50,000 would sort of be the absolute minimum. And if you think about that, that means that right today, you are worth 500,000, because if 10% of you is worth 50,000 in cash today, your potential is worth a minimum on a 100% basis of $500,000. That is the big financial asset you've got. It's way more important what you do with that $500,000 asset that you own today than whether you decide to buy stocks or bonds, or whether you put your money in a mutual fund or pick your own stocks or anything of that sort. The biggest financial asset that you have going for you by miles is the value of your own earning power over the years. So that's really what you should focus on. If you're focusing on your financial future, that means you should focus on you. Because whether your 10% is worth 50,000 or 100,000 or 300,000, which would be 500,000 or a million or 3 million for all of you, whether it turns out to be one or the other is really dependent in a very large part on what you do in the next few years. All of you in this room have the brains to do extremely well in life. You've all got the energy to do extremely well in life, and then the question is, how do you apply it? If you've got a 200 horsepower motor, do you get 200 horsepower out of it? Do you get your full potential, or do you get 100 horsepower or 50 horsepower? Now, there's two things that can hold you back in getting the full horsepower out of your engine, whatever it may be. All of you have big enough engines. And one of those is a lack of education, but that probably isn't going to happen to very many people in this room. If you did have a lack of education, if you didn't have a chance to get a decent education in life, it wouldn't make any difference what that potential was, because you'd never unlock it. But the second most important thing, and equally as important, is in terms of the habits that you develop, in terms of what you do with yourself. When we hire people, we look for three qualities. We look for integrity, we look for intelligence, and we look for energy. But if they don't have the first one, integrity, the other two will kill you. Because if you're hiring somebody without integrity, you really want them to be dumb and lazy, don't you? I mean, the last thing in the world you want for them is to be smart and energetic. So smart and energetic only goes with integrity. But the nice thing about you make your own decision on that. You can't change your IQ or how far you can throw a football or how high you can jump or the color of your hair very easily. But you can elect to have integrity that matches anybody else's. And if you match that with intelligence, which you have, and energy, which you have, you will get an extraordinary result, and you'd be very foolish to sell me 10% of yourself for 50,000. On the other hand, if you don't match it with that, your potential will, in a significant part, go unused. And I'll give you a little simple test to apply in terms of thinking about the kind of habits you want to develop, because you can have any habits you want to be. You can be lazy, you can be prompt, you can be late, you can be honest, you can cut corners. I mean, you have all these choices. And those are choices for you to make. Nobody else is going to make them for you. And I would suggest that you play this little game with me, too. Think about the person you would most like to be in life. So maybe it's one of your contemporaries, maybe it's somebody a little older, but pick out the person you admire the most, the person that you'd change places with if you could. And then write down why you admire them. Just put it on a piece of paper. And then figure out the person that you would least like to change places with you. Who really turns you off? Who do you find repulsive? And list the reasons why that person turns you off so much. And put those down on the other side of the paper. And then look at that list. And you'll find that everything on the left-hand side, what you admire in other people, the qualities they bring to life, cheerfulness, generosity, all kinds of things, you'll find those are things you can do yourself. It's very simple. You got to apply yourself, but the habits you form in doing that early on will carry you through life. And on the other hand, you'll find that the things that make people repulsive, selfishness, obnoxiousness, all these things, egotism,
are things that no one has to have. If you find those in yourself, you can get rid of them as long as you get rid of them early. So all I suggest is that you write down a list of what you admire, what you find contemptible, and decide that the ones on the admired side are ones you're going to acquire for yourself. And if you do that when you're young, it'll carry you through the rest of your life. This doesn't work if you do it when you're 50 or 60. By then the habits are too well formed. But if you do it early, behavior becomes a habit. So if you do that, 2 or 3 years from now, if you go through the same exercise, you'll find out that the person you admire the most is yourself. That can be a little dangerous under some circumstances, but it's not a bad thing. I mean, you want to be somebody you like, and you don't want to be somebody that you dislike. And form those habits early. You basically can't miss. Now, I'll give you one other small piece of advice that's just a corollary on this, and then we'll get to your questions. And that is, as a general matter, as a one piece of specific financial advice, I would say, avoid credit cards. Just forget about them. We're in various businesses that issue credit cards. The American public loves credit cards. But if you start revolving debt on credit cards, you're going to be paying 18 or 20%. And you can't make progress in your financial life going around borrowing money at 18 or 20%. You can make a lot of money by lending it out at 18 or 20% over time. If you can find anybody that's good that will borrow from you. But you don't want to be on the side of the equation that's always behind in life. I was lucky. I'd saved about $10,000 by the time I got out of school. That $10,000 was really worth millions I might have earned later on, because after you get a family and everything, the expenses roll in. But those were my tools to work with, but it was only because I was ahead of the game. If you're behind the game by $10,000 at some point and paying 18 or 20% interest on it, you'll never get out of it. So the trick, I've got a partner that says, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. And that's true in financial matters as well. You want to figure out where you don't want to be ahead of time and avoid that. And I get about a dozen letters a day from people who are having terrible problems. And there are 2 reasons why they have terrible problems. One is a number of them have had health problems of some sort. I mean, they have really been hit by or somebody in their family has been hit by some kind of catastrophic illness. And that is it's a terrible thing to happen to any family. And they run up bills they can't pay, and really only society can solve that one in terms of protecting people against that. That's just plain bad luck. But the other one is from people who run up credit card debt, and they're facing bankruptcy, or they've been through bankruptcy once before, and they owe a whole bunch of money, and they can't even pay the interest, let alone pay any principal. And half of my letters come from people like that, and that problem is avoidable. Catastrophic illness is not, but credit card debt is something you bring on yourself, and it's way better, it's way easier to stay out of trouble than to get out of trouble financially. And I will guarantee you, if you run up big credit card debts, you will be in trouble probably the rest of your life in terms of your financial situation. On the other hand, if you get ahead of the game, even it's on a very modest scale, so that money is coming in from investing, and people owe you money, or equities owe you ownership, you'll be way ahead of the game compared to paying it, always paying your creditors every month. So my advice to you is, if you can't pay for it, don't buy it, and get yourself in a position where you can pay for anything, and then we'll be glad to see you at Borsheim's or the Nebraska Furniture Mart.
I'd like to just say a few words preliminarily, and then the highlight for me will be getting your questions in a few minutes, because I want to talk about what's on your mind. I urge you to throw hard balls. It's more fun for me if you put a little speed on the pitches as they come in. You can ask about anything except last week's Texas A&M game. That's off limits. We have a couple of men here from SunTrust. I was just up at the Coke meeting, and I sit next to Jimmy Williams there, who ran SunTrust for many years, and he wanted to be sure that I wore this SunTrust shirt down here.
I've tried to get sponsorship on the senior golf tour. I haven't had much luck, but now on the bankers tour, I'm doing a little bit better. And he says I get a percentage of the increase in deposits in Gainesville. So all go out for SunTrust, dear old SunTrust. I would like to talk for just 1 minute to the students about your future when you leave here, because you're going to learn a tremendous amount about investments, and you'll learn enough to do well. You've all got the IQ to do well. You've all got the initiative and energy to do well, or you wouldn't be here. And most of you will succeed in meeting your aspirations. But in determining whether you succeed, there's more to it than intellect and energy, and I'd like to talk for just a second about that. In fact, there was a fellow that Pete Kiewit in Omaha used to say that he looked for 3 things in hiring people. He looked for integrity, intelligence, and energy, and he said if the person didn't have the first 2, that the latter 2 would kill him, because if they don't have integrity, you want them dumb and lazy. You don't want them smart and energetic. And I really like to talk about that first one, because we know you've got the second 2. And to play along with me in a little game for just a second, in terms of thinking about that question, you've all been here, I guess almost all of your second-year MBAs, and you've gotten to know your classmates. And think for a moment that I granted you the right to buy 10% of one of your classmates for the rest of his or her lifetime. Now you can't pick one with a rich father. That doesn't count. I mean, you've got to pick somebody who's going to do it on their own merit. And I gave you an hour to think about it. Which one are you going to pick among all your classmates as for the one you want to own 10% of for the rest of their lifetime? Are you going to give them an IQ test? Pick the one with the highest IQ? I doubt it. Are you going to pick the one with the best grades? I doubt it. You're not even going to pick the most energetic one necessarily. You're the one that displays the most initiative. But you're going to start looking for qualitative factors in addition to, because everybody's got enough brains here and enough energy. And I would say that if you thought about it for an hour and decided who you're going to place that bet on, you'd probably pick the one who you responded the best to, because the one that was going to have the leadership qualities, the one that was going to be able to get other people to carry out their interests. And that would be the person who was generous and honest and who gave credit to other people even for their own ideas, all kinds of qualities like that. And you could write down those qualities that you admire in this other person, whoever you admire most in the class. And then I would throw in a hooker. I would say as part of owning 10% of this person, you had to agree to go short 10% of somebody else in the class. That's more fun, isn't it? And you think, well, now who do I want to go short of? And again, you wouldn't pick the person with the lowest IQ you would start thinking about the person really who turned you off for one reason or another. I mean, they had various qualities, quite apart from their academic achievement, but they had various qualities. In the end, you shouldn't really want to be around them, and other people didn't want to be around them. And what were the qualities that lead to that? Well, there'd be a whole bunch of things, but it's the person who's egotistical, the person who's greedy, the person who's slightly dishonest, cuts corners, all of these qualities. And you could write those down on the right-hand side of the page. And when you look at that, I don't know which one I'm using. Can you hear me okay with this? Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Your microphone on the side. Just come back up.
What do I do with it?
It just came loose.
Oh, it just came loose. Okay. You can see why I avoid technology. Chewing gum is about as far as I get. As you looked at those qualities on the left and right-hand side, there's one interesting thing about them. It's not the ability to throw a football 60 yards. It's not the ability to run the 100-yard dash in 9.3. It's not being the best-looking person in the class. They're all qualities that if you really want to have the ones on the left-hand side, you can have them. I mean, they're qualities of behavior, temperament, character that are achievable. They're not forbidden to anybody in this group. And if you look at the qualities on the right-hand side, the ones that you find turn you off in other people, there's not a quality there that you have to have. If you have it, you can get rid of it, and you can get rid of it a lot easier at your age than you can at my age, because most behavior is habitual, and they say the chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken. And there's no question about it. I see people with these self-destructive behavior patterns at my age or even 10 or 20 years younger, and they really are entrapped by them. They go around and they do things that turn off other people
right and left. And they don't need to be that way, but by a certain point they get so they can hardly change it. But at your age, you can have any habits, any patterns of behavior that you wish. It's simply a question of which you decide. And why not decide the ones that, I mean, if you like, Ben Graham did this, and Ben Franklin did it before him, but Ben Graham in his low teens looked around and he looked at the people he admired, and he said, I want to be admired, so why don't I just behave like them? And he found there was nothing impossible about behaving like them. And similarly, he did the same thing on the reverse side in terms of getting rid of those qualities. So I would suggest that if you write those qualities down and think about them a little while and make them habitual, you will be the one that you want to buy 10% of when you get all through. And the beauty of it is you already own 100%, and you're stuck with it. So you might as well be that person as somebody else. Well, that's a short little sermon. So let's get on to what.
Start a little bit where the president left off, which is this is your hometown. This is a part of your hometown. So, what are your best memories about being around Georgetown? And
well, I delivered papers at Georgetown Hospital 66 years ago, and I developed this affinity because in the hospital people tipped. My regular customers, the one that knew me, never tipped. But I would go to the hospital, and one of the things they would do, they would give me cash tips, but they also would tell me if they were a woman that had given birth to a baby that was, we'll say, 8 pounds, 11 ounces, they would whisper that number to me. And the numbers racket was very big in Washington that time, and they felt they were giving me this terribly valuable information, the exact time in which the baby was born or something. And I was supposed to bet on that number in the numbers racket that day. So I have a lot of memories of Georgetown, and I was here during World War II, which was really a fascinating time to be in Washington. And my dad being in Congress, it was really a window on an extraordinary time in America. And of course, at that time, we were probably more united than at any time in my lifetime about a common goal. I mean, that was the time when people like Bobby Feller and all the athletes, the day the war broke out, went down and enlisted, and people really did voluntarily in a very high percentage play by the rules in terms of gasoline rationing and sugar rationing and meat rationing and all that. And we all bought savings bonds at school to help out the troops. So it was quite a period.
well, so somewhere along there you started investing and changed the nature. And I've read stories that you started investing at 13, or whether they're true or not, but somewhere around that. And
it was 11.
what created the fascination with investing?
It took me 5 years. I had to save $120. It took me 5 years to get the $120 to buy a stock, 3 shares of City Service Preferred when I was 11. My dad originally was in the investment business. He really wasn't very interested in it, but I would go down on Saturday morning, and he had these books there in the office, and I read all those, and then I went to the Omaha Public Library, and I read every book on investments in the Omaha Public Library by the time we moved to Washington. And then when we got here, I had the Library of Congress.
Did you get through all those?
Oh, I read everything, and I just found it fascinating, and incidentally, I find it fascinating today. I mean, it's an activity. If you're a baseball player or something, your legs may go or something. Well, my legs have long gone, but it doesn't make any difference in what I do. So it's I literally have as much. I always have had fun working, but I have as much fun now as I've ever had in my life. I mean, I work with people I love doing what I love, and it just doesn't get any better than that.
Well, the quote is that you tap dance to work every day?
I tap dance to work, yeah.
And so what makes you do that?
Don't ask me to demonstrate, but incidentally, it was nice to get that round of applause at the start, but I've learned that crowds now applaud at the start because I'm 83 and they're not sure I'll be around at the end of the talk.
I've shared enough dinners with you know that you have more energy than anybody I know. So let's switch to a little bit on the philanthropy side. So
Sure.
President DeGioia talked about the giving pledge. How did you come up with the idea with Bill, and how are you doing on it? I mean,
well, we're doing great. And it was, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, Bill and Melinda and I were out in California and talking, and I'm not exactly sure how it came up, but we decided to call or write David Rockefeller and ask if he would host a dinner in New York for about 16 or 18 people, just to talk about philanthropy. And Oprah Winfrey came, and Mayor Bloomberg was there, and it was a private dinner. And I started having these people talk around the table as to how they developed their philosophy of philanthropy. It must have taken us 2.5 hours or so to get around. I mean, people were really interested in it. So Bill and I were at that dinner. We decided that maybe there would be a possibility of taking this passion which these people had shown and going to other people that had a great deal of money and see if we could develop something where people would pledge at least half their net worth. And we now have about 115 people. I've been dialing for dollars. I call these billionaires up, and sometimes they tell me how they can't do it, and I decided, I tell them I'm going to write a book on how to live on $500 million because apparently there's this great need. They just can't seem to figure out how to do it, and they need help. But it's been very rewarding, and I received a letter from one woman. She and her husband had over $10 billion, and she sent me a tie. She sent me 2 ties, and she sent me this handwritten note and said that they hadn't really faced it. It's a little like facing your own mortality to some extent, making that plan, and that's tough for people sometimes. And so she and her husband had changed things, and over half of that $10 billion was going to go to philanthropy. They do tend to postpone the decision. So I tell these people I call, the last will is what counts. But I tell them, if I'm talking to some 70-year-old, do you really think your decision-making ability is going to be better when you're 95 with some blonde on your lap or now? And so let's get on board, fellas.
And I assume that convinces them maybe the 70-year-old decision's better at that point, right?
Well, Bill has done it trivia. Bill has gotten people around the world because he travels more than I do. But what we're hoping is people do pick up on norms. I mean, when I was young, I read about Carnegie and Rockefeller and different people. Bill did too. And you do pick up behavior from those who come before. And we've collected letters from every one of these people. They're up on our website at thegivingpledge.org. And I think they're worth reading. They're pretty remarkable. And of course, what we really want to do is get the younger people, like Mark Zuckerberg's joined us, for example. And he obviously is going to appeal to a much wider group than I would. So we hope it becomes, this gospel of wealth that Andrew Carnegie came up with 100 years or so ago. That's influenced all kinds of people. Well, we've got better stories than that, on these letters. So I just hope it moves. Now, I don't think, I want to emphasize one thing. Nobody in our group has given away $1 that in any way affects how they live. I mean, I have the much greater admiration, frankly, for the person who drops $5 or $1 in a collection plate on Sunday, where it makes a difference in whether they go take their kids to a movie or whether they go eat out or something of the sort. They are actually giving up something that has utility to them. I am giving up nothing that has utility to me. I have everything in the world I want that can be bought by money. So I have a whole bunch of stock certificates. They have no utility to me, and they can possibly have enormous utility to other people in vaccines or education or all kinds of things. So the people that give up something that actually can have utility to their family and give that to some other person so it has utility to them, those are the people I really think deserve the kudos. But it's still nice to go where the money is. I mean, it's the Willie Sutton approach. So if we can work on polio or something like that, and it takes big contributions, then we want to go after it.
So, I mean, the unique part of what you've done is with Bill and Melinda and their foundation, and on the one hand, how you're doing it, and secondly, that you've gone and said whatever the number will be, but almost all your wealth.
All my Berkshire wealth.
And so talk about the Gates relationship and why you chose them as opposed to creating your own foundation or something.
Well, originally my wife and I planned when we were in our 20s that when we had everything we needed, we would use the rest for society. And I thought she would outlive me. She was younger, and women live longer, and then she died in 2004. So I had to come up with a different plan. And if you've read Adam Smith and the specialization of labor, you know that if you're good at one thing, you're not necessarily good at another. You ought to get the person, you ought to use your talents where they're most useful, and get other people to give their talents. So, when my wife
had babies. I mean, I went to an obstetrician. I didn't deliver myself. When I get a toothache, I go to a dentist. So I wanted to go to people who were very good at giving away money and who were younger, energetic, smart, and had the same objectives in philanthropy that I did. And the basic principle of the Gates Foundation is that every human life has equal value. And if you start with that as your basic assumption, then a lot of things flow from that. And Bill and Melinda, as well as my children, because I have foundations for each one of my three children that are of significant size, and you can read the letters I wrote them up on the Berkshire Hathaway website. I do not direct them to do anything, but I do tell them to swing for the fences. I tell them if they succeed at everything they do in philanthropy, they're doing the wrong things, because the important things are the tough ones, and you're going to fail at some of those. But I have got much younger people, very energetic people, common objectives, and they work for nothing. So that's not a bad deal, Brian.
That stretches the money a long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the way I read it is that you require them to actually move the money out the other side.
They got to spend it. And when I die, all of the money has to be spent within 10 years after the estate is closed, because I do not think that I can pick out some little great-great-grandchild yet to be born, just because he has the right name of Buffett or she has the right name, and they will be the best custodians. I mean, there'll be plenty of philanthropists 50 years after I die to take care of the problems of 50 years, but I want the money to get spent promptly, and I don't believe in trying to control things from the grave. I mean, I like to think I can think outside the box, but thinking outside of that particular box.
That may take a lot of philanthropy to figure that one out. Recently I read an article about Eastlake and Tom Cousins. So this week, as many people know, the PGA finishes up its tournament at Eastlake, which is a golf course in Atlanta. And the story I read about the development is that you've now helped Tom Cousins in the development work he does with communities. Talk a little about that, because that's a little different than this type of thing.
Yeah, but it's the same theory of loving to back people who are putting their own time and energy and who are successful into a project that's worthwhile. Tom Cousins is a remarkable man who lives in Atlanta, just extraordinary. And he took this terrible, terrible neighborhood called Eastlake in Atlanta, and against a lot of community opposition, everything, it was crime-ridden, and nobody did it well in school and everything else. And he decided you had to apply a holistic approach to it, and you couldn't just attack this thing or that thing. So he worked for probably 10 years to develop this entirely new community out of this total disaster. And then Tom and I talked about it, and I said, Tom, everybody's going to say that it can only be done because you're Tom Cousins and you live in Atlanta and you've done this. So he and I and a fellow named Julian Robertson, but primarily Tom, decided to see if we could replicate this in other communities. And it seemed to me that, and Tom, that New Orleans was a great one to do it. I mean, they've been racked by this, like Katrina and everything. So we've taken it to New Orleans, where we've got hundreds of people, and it's mixed income type community. I mean, we do not want to have it with everybody being subsidized. We want to create a new kind of community where people of different races, different economic conditions work together and play together. And it's been successful in New Orleans. We went to Indianapolis. It's been successful there, and we've got about 11 more towns we're working on now. And so Tom Cousins has really come up with something. He had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago describing this, but he's a fantastic human being. And when you get a chance to join forces with somebody that as high quality as that, and energetic and smart, and putting his own funds in it, you just got to jump at the chance.
That's true. We'll switch to the economy now. What's going on, and move from philanthropy to the economy that you create your wealth off of, that you can do these wonderful, great things with. So what do you see in the economy and what you're seeing in your companies, your operating companies, and from an investor's point?
Well, our business has come back very well from 5 years ago when the panic hit. And it was a panic like nobody's ever seen. I mean, whatever you think about it, it was worse. I'm dead serious about that. We were right on the edge of the cliff. And fortunately, I give enormous credit to both Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner
And frankly, even though I didn't vote for him, never voted for him, President Bush, you know, I don't know how many of you have studied economics, but in Adam Smith they talk about comparative advantage, and you know, Keynes talked about animal spirits and all those people. But President Bush really came out with the great economic insight of all times, and he did it in 10 words in September of 2008. He went out there from the White House and he said, if money doesn't loosen up, this sucker could go down. And I mean, that goes right up there. Tear down those plaques of Adam Smith. and he backed up those fellows. And so we've come back from it. But businesses come back. You know, a lot of companies are having record profits, including many of ours. And the American populace as a whole has not come back. I mean, inequality is getting wider. The Forbes 400, which just came out, showed aggregate wealth for the Forbes 400 of $2 trillion. You go back 20 years and that was 300 billion. So it's up 6 or 7 for one. It's different people to some extent, but this is the top. 300 billion to 2 trillion. And if you read the paper today, you'd have seen that the median income, you know, is the same place it was in terms of real purchasing power. From 1989, it hasn't changed. So the inequality is getting wider. The rich are doing extremely well, extraordinarily well. And business is doing well. Business profit margins are terrific compared to the record historically. Business returns on tangible equity are terrific. But most, you know, a great many people in our country, if you take the bottom 20% of households, that's 24 million households or something like that, housing, you know, close to about 60 million people. You know, the top level is $22,000. You know, I don't want to try to live on $22,000 with a couple of kids. So we've got an economy that is delivering $50,000 of GDP per capita, and we've got an awful lot of people that aren't living well. So we have learned how to turn out lots of goods and services, but we haven't learned as well how to have everybody share in the bounty that we have.
So how do you think, is that we just got to grow out of it to provide?
Well, we're growing. We're growing. Yeah. I mean, if you take even 2% a year, if you think about it, people feel very unhappy with 2% a year, but the population grows 1% a year. So that means 1% per capita real growth. That means in 20 years, a generation, there's a 20% gain in GDP per capita. That's not bad in a generation. Right. But the question is how it gets distributed. Right. But this country will grow. This system works. You know, in my lifetime, I was born in 1930. I was conceived in 1929 because my dad was a stock salesman, and after the crash, he didn't have anything to do. Nobody. So I look back with great fondness on the 1929 crash. But since 1930. Since I was born in 1930, real GDP per capita has increased 6 for 1. Just think of that, 6 for 1. I mean, you went centuries when nothing happened. Right. for people, and this country works. I mean, I consider the luckiest person on a probabilistic basis that ever lived is the baby that's born today in the United States. I mean, it is a fabulous country, and the market system works, all kinds of things. But we do have to, in my view, we have to make sure that everybody participates to a reasonable degree. We don't want equality results, but we also want a base level that's satisfactory for our people.
So you talked about the George Bush's statement, economic statement about they could go down. What do you think the lessons are of the last couple of cycles that you've seen from an investor standpoint? We've got a lot of young kids out there. You've lived through multiple cycles in the 50, 60 years plus you've been investing, yeah. 70 years investing. What are the lessons, and what, you know, these are young people, what should they take away?
The lessons are that people will continue to make the same mistakes they've made. I mean, humans, and it doesn't correlate to IQ particularly. I mean, when they get greedy, and we had this huge bubble in the most important asset the American public has, housing. I mean, so you had a huge bubble in something that you could borrow heavily against. So you could run a margin account effect on a house instead of stocks, and the conditions got very lax. And so when that bubble popped, but people came into that gradually. When they get fearful, it happens all at once. I mean, when everybody wants when people get scared, they all want to leave at one time. And we had them all want to leave at one time, and that'll happen again. It'll happen with a different set of circumstances, but the human animal will keep behaving pretty much the way it has in the past. So we will have periodic recessions. We'll have an occasional panic, which doesn't all recessions don't come from panics, but the good news is, if you look at the 20th century, in the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, we had the Great Depression, we had the flu epidemic, we had the Cold War, we had the atom bomb, you name it. The Dow Jones average went from 66 to 11,497. With all these terrible things happening supposedly at various times. America works. And when I bought my first stock when I was 11, that was in the spring of 1942. And that was a couple months after Pearl Harbor. And we were getting clobbered in the Pacific at Corregidor and Bataan, the Death March of Bataan. And in the European theater, the Blitz of England was on. And the Dow was at about 100. But just look at where we are now. The country really works. The trick is, it seems to me the obligation of a society as prosperous as ours is to figure out how nobody gets left too far behind.
Right. It was interesting because last year Bono's speech was a lot about how America is a society of dreams and you can accomplish more here. It was actually one of the best speeches about the optimism America could have by a person who's not American by birth. So and I know you carry that optimism. So after all this, what makes you most optimistic for the next decade about America?
Well,
or next couple decades?
Just imagine, 1789. Just go back just a few hundred years. There wasn't anything here, in this country. And Sir Christopher Wren, I think, that designed St. Paul's Cathedral is buried there, and there's a little plaque there, and it says, if you seek my monument, look about you. Well, I say, in America, if you seek America's monument, look about you. This country has all come about in a few hundred years. We had less than 4 million people, when we became a country. China had 300 million people at that time. Europe had about 75 million. They were just as smart as we were. They worked just as hard as we did. They had natural resources that were similar to ours. And yet we ended up with a quarter of the world's GDP, a few hundred years later. We've got something that works, and we don't want to mess that up. We want to figure out what we do with this abundance better as we go along. But you don't have to worry about the system working. But you will have periodic recessions, and you will have an occasional panic brought on by something that who knows where it comes from. The thing to remember at that time, I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in the fall of 2008, and I said, that the country will come back. It'll go through a big recession and everything, but it'll come back, and it's coming back. So don't ever worry about America. It'll tell you, you're in the right place.
So you've been famous for your investment strategy on basically that follows the opposite side of that principle is invest when the chips are down and ride it up. That served you well. So what's your favorite time that you were able to accomplish that, when you caught somebody down and moved
well,
up?
I always think my favorite time's going to be tomorrow. It's always been fun. And there's a company here in Washington called Geico. And I first got exposed to that in 1950. I was 20 years. I was 19 years. It was 51. I'm sorry. I was 20 years old, and I came down here, and I came down on a Saturday because I'd learned that my professor who I worshiped at Columbia named Ben Graham was the chairman. I got down here and the door was locked. When I went to the building, because it was Saturday, and I pounded on the door, and some janitor let me in, and a marvelous fellow named Lorimer Davidson spent 4 hours with me teaching me all about insurance, and he helped me so much in life. You're going to get help by some wonderful people in life. It's a great thing to remember later on when you get to be my age, that all the help you've received from different people, because nobody does it alone. Obama got in trouble when he said that in the campaign, that nobody does it by themselves. Nobody does do it by themselves. We all sit in the shade of trees that were planted by others. So it's obligatory, I think, to plant a few trees ourselves if we've had good luck. It's been a great ride, but it's not over.
So you've owned. When did you actually buy Geico? When did you invest in Geico the first time?
Geico I bought. I met Lorimer Davidson when I was finishing up at Columbia, and
And then I started selling securities when I got out. And I went out to my Aunt Alice, and my Aunt Alice would have bought anything from me. And so she bought 100 shares of Government Employees Insurance. It was the first stock I ever sold. And then a lot of years passed, and Mr. Davidson was very kind to me in a variety of ways. But I went in different directions. And then in 1976, the company got in big trouble because they miscalculated their reserves, and they were going broke. And so I came back here, and I bought a third of the company in the market in a very short period of time. And then in 1995, by now our third had become a half because they'd repurchased their shares. And I went out to see Mr. Davidson, who was out in Bethesda. He was 96 or 97, and he had a bunch of stock in Geico with no cost basis because he'd held it forever. And I said, Davey, if I make an offer for this company for cash, you're going to pay a big tax. And of course, if you die with the stock, you don't have that tax, and you get a stepped up basis. So I'm not going to make this offer unless it's all right with you. And he said to me, he said, Warren, he said, I've hoped for this all my life. And so we bought the rest of the company. He was a great man.
Imagine for a moment that you decided to invest money now, and you bought a farm. And the farmland around here, let's say you bought 160 acres, and you bought it at X per share, or per acre. And the farmer next to you had 160 identical acres, same contour, same quality of soil quality. So it was identical. And that farmer next door to you was a very peculiar character, because every day that farmer with the identical farm said, I'll sell you my farm, or I'll buy your farm at a certain price, which he would name. Now, that's a very obliging neighbor. I mean, that's got to be a plus to have a fellow like that with the next farm. You don't get that with farms. You get it with stocks. If you own 100 shares of General Motors, on Monday morning, somebody will buy your 100 shares or sell you another 100 shares at exactly the same price, and that goes on 5 days a week. But just imagine if you had a farmer doing that. When you bought the farm, you looked at what the farm would produce. That was what went through your mind. You were saying to yourself, I'm paying X dollars per acre. I think I'll get so many bushels of corn or soybeans on average. Some years good, some years bad. Some years the price will be good, some years the price will be bad, etc. But you think about the potential of the farm. And now you get this idiot that buys a farm next to you, and on top of that, he's sort of a manic depressive and drinks, maybe smokes a little pot. So his numbers just go all over the place. Now, the only thing you have to do is to remember that this guy next door is there to serve you and not to instruct you. You bought the farm because you thought the farm was had the potential. You don't really need a quote on it. If you bought in with John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie, and there were never any quotes. Well, there were quotes later on, but basically, you bought into the business, and that's what you're doing when you buy stocks. But you get this added advantage that you do have this neighbor who you're not obliged to listen to at all, who is going to give you a price every day, and he's going to have his ups and downs, and maybe he'll name a silly price that he'll buy at, in which case you sell if you want to, or maybe he'll name a very low price and you'll buy his farm from him. But you don't have to, and you don't want to put yourself in a position where you have to. So stocks have this enormous inherent advantage of people yelling out prices all the time to you, and many people turn that into a disadvantage. And of course, many people can profit in one way or another from telling you that they can tell you what this farmer's going to yell out tomorrow or next, your neighboring farmer's going to yell out tomorrow or next week or next month. There's huge money in it. So people tell you that it's important and they know, and that you should pay a lot of attention to their thoughts about what price changes should be, or you tell yourself that there should be this great difference. But the truth is, if you owned the businesses you liked prior to the virus arriving, it changes prices and it changes, but nobody's forcing you to sell. And if you really like the business and you like the management you're in with, and the business hasn't fundamentally changed, and I'll get to that a little when I report on Berkshire, which I will soon, I promise. The stocks have an enormous advantage, and you still can bet on America, but you can't bet unless you're willing and have an outlook to independently decide that you want to own a cross-section of America, because I don't think most people are in a position to pick single stocks. A few maybe, but on balance, I think people are much better off buying a cross-section of America and just forgetting about it. If I'd done that when I got out of college, it's all I had to do to make 100 for one and then collect dividends on top of it, which would increase substantially over time. The American tailwind is marvelous. American business represents, and it's going to have interruptions, and you're not going to foresee the interruptions, and you do not want to get yourself in a position where those interruptions can affect you, either because you're leveraged or because you're psychologically unable to handle looking at a bunch of numbers. If you really had a farm and you had this neighbor, and one day he offered you $2,000 an acre, and the next day he offers you $1,200 an acre, and maybe the day after that he offers you $800 an acre, are you really going to feel that at $2,000 an acre, when you had evaluated what the farm would produce, are you going to let this guy drive you into thinking I better sell because his number keeps coming in lower all the time? It's a very, very, very important matter to bring the right psychological approach to owning common stocks. But I will tell you, if you bet on America and sustain that position for decades, you're going to do better than, in my view, far better than owning Treasury securities, or far better than following people who tell you that what the farmer's going to yell out next. There's huge amounts of money that people pay for advice they really don't need.
Warren, how would you define true success?
Well, I've said many times that if you get to be 65 or 70 and later, and the people that you want to have love you actually do love you, you're a success. I've never seen anybody that reaches that age. I mean, I'm not talking about somebody that's in extreme poverty or pain or something, but I've never seen anybody that, if they have a lot of people that love them, that is other than happy. And I've seen some very, very wealthy people that they give testimonial dinners to and name schools after and everything. And nobody loves them, you know. Their own kids would say, he's in the attic, you know. They never came.
What are, say, 3 pieces of advice you would give to people who are looking to succeed in business?
Well, by far the best investment you can make is in yourself. I mean, for example, communication skills. I tell the students that come that they're going to graduate schools and business, and they're learning all these complicated formulas and all that. If they just learn to communicate better, and both in writing and in person, they increase their value at least 50%. And I mean, if you can't communicate, somebody says, you know, it's like winking at a girl in the dark. Nothing happens, you know, basically. And you have to be able to get forth your ideas, and that's relatively easy. I did it myself with the Dale Carnegie course. Some people wish I'd taken a shorter course now in terms of my talking later on, but it's just hugely important. And if you invest in yourself, nobody can take it away from you. I mean, the second thing, which I'll get a certain criticism for not living it, but I do tell those students, you know, that if I gave you a car and it'd be the only car you get in the rest of your life, you'd take care of it like you can't believe. Any scratch, you'd fix that moment. You'd read the owner's manual. You'd keep a garage and do all these things. And you get exactly one mind and one body in this world. And you can't start taking care of it when you're 50. By that time, you'll have rusted out if you haven't done anything. So you should really make sure that you just remember that you just got one mind and body to get through life with and to do the most with it.
What about life advice?
Well, life advice is, the most important thing, aside from the things I've talked about already, is really who you associate with. You want to associate with people that are better than you are. I mean, basically, you'll go in the direction of the people that you associate with, and you want to have the right heroes. You want people, if you want to emulate somebody, you better pick very carefully who you want to emulate. And when obviously you can't pick your parents. They're going to have an enormous influence on you, but you don't get a choice on that. But you get choices as you go down the line, and who you admire, who you want to copy, and the most important for most people in terms of that decision is their spouse. It's also important in terms of a partner in business, but the partner in life is the most important one. You want to pick a spouse that's better than you are, and then he or she, and you hope they don't figure it out too fast.
Great. Biggest mistakes people make when investing?
Well, they try to, they just don't realize that all you have to do is just buy a cross-section of America and then never listen to people like me or read the papers or do anything subsequently. They think that because you can trade, you should trade. You buy a farm, you buy an apartment house, you can't resell it tomorrow, and the cost of moving around. Now you get something handed to you, liquidity, which is instant. You can sell, and the cost of doing it are pennies, compared to other kinds of investment activity. So because they can so easily move around, they do move around, and moving around is not smarter than investing.
You have a pretty cool morning routine regarding what you have for breakfast and how prosperous you feel. What is that?
Well, I now actually send somebody over to McDonald's usually to get me something. Since the publicity I got from earlier describing my habits at McDonald's, I now have somebody go in the office, but that was more for entertainment value. I eat exactly what I like to eat. If I liked it on my 6th birthday, at my 6th birthday party when we had hot dogs and hamburgers and Coke and ice cream with chocolate, I still like it. And I don't care about anything subsequently. I discovered it all by the time I was 6. If somebody offered me a deal when I was 20 and said, you're going to live 1 year longer, instead of living to 88, you'll live to 89 or whatever it may be, if you eat nothing but broccoli and Brussels sprouts and onions and all these things, I just said, I'll take the last year off. It probably won't be that good anyway. So I eat what I like to eat. I'm not venturesome in that area.
I like how you lumped in onions with broccoli and Brussels sprouts.
Well,
Never heard that.
I just don't happen to like onions, but no, I don't put them in the same category.
Okay. You and George H.W. Bush, I think. Is business school worth it?
Depends on the person. Much more than it depends on the school. I mean, I wouldn't worry. Some people are going to get a lot out of advanced education, and some people are going to get very little. And I don't even think it's important that every person go to college at all. I mean, we have all kinds of jobs at 70 or so thousand a year, 80,000 a year, that college training is not of use. And I actually was not keen on going to college myself. Yeah, my dad kind of jollied me into it. He could get me to do anything. But if they'd had an SAT test in those days, he would have taken the test for me. But because I knew I could have a good time, and I liked investing, and I didn't really feel I could read the books. So I don't, it's a big commitment to take 4 years, and the cost involved, and maybe the loans involved, and everything. And I think depending on what your interests are in life, I don't think it's for everybody. I think it's for a lot of people, but there ought to be a reason you're going, and I didn't really see much reason.
All right, last question. So lightning round, so there's a few. Do you ever drink water?
Only under duress.
What is your favorite all-time song, Warren?
It's undoubtedly, it's My Way.
What about movie? Favorite movie?
Well, I like The Bridge on the River Kwai because of there were a lot of lessons in that. Plus, it was, enormously fascinating.
Catchy tune also.
Pardon me?
Catchy tune also.
Yeah,
Right,
very.
right.
But the ending of that was sort of the story of life, He created the railroad, and did he really want the enemy to come in across it?
Got it. Favorite book?
Well, the favorite book from the book that had the most impact on my life was The Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham.
I knew you were going to say that. Favorite TV show?
It's probably going to be it would be Nebraska in some huge bowl game and winning.
And finally, what do you carry in your wallet and how much money do you tend to carry around?
Well, I probably carry maybe $400. I actually my wife likes to use the cash, so I just take home a chunk of cash every now and then she doles it out. She looks at my billfold and sees whether all the hundreds are gone. Sticks a few in there, but it's pretty simple.
And credit cards?
I've got an American Express card which I got in 1964, but I pay cash 98% of the time. If I'm in a restaurant, I always pay cash. It's just easier.
Warren Buffett.
Stay out of the obituaries, I feel fine about that. One of the comments that Howard Simons used to make at the Washington Post, Howard Simons was the managing editor at the time of Watergate under Ben Bradley, later went on to run the Neiman program, and when people constantly complain that you in the news business know that, how can you write about business when you haven't been in business, and how can you write about sports when you haven't been a football player yourself? And his retort to that was, you don't have to be dead to write obituaries. Now, the topic of dealing with the news media seems to me that probably the best advice I can give to you who have to do that is that it's really very much like the old advice about making love to a porcupine, that it should be done very carefully. But nevertheless, I have very fond memories of the media because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the newspaper business. My grandfather in 1905 bought the Cumming County Democrat in West Point, Nebraska. Believe it or not, in West Point, which was probably 2,000 people in those days, there were two newspapers, the West Point Republican and the Cumming County Democrat. His grandson learned something out of what it's like to operate in the two newspaper town from his grandfather. But these two newspapers existed, and my grandfather had his family, and my mother and her sisters and one brother, they lived over the newspaper in a little string of rooms on the second floor. And when my mother was 11, she literally could run a linotype. As a matter of fact, the intertype people who made linotypes in those days wanted her to travel to Des Moines to exhibit the operation of a linotype to prove their statement that such a simple machine that even an 11-year-old could operate it. And she would go down to the train station where twice a day the train would come through, and she would get on the train when it stopped because news was a little sparse in West Point. She'd interview people, write stories for the paper. She sold ads for the paper. It was all during high school years. She started the West Point high school paper. And when she got out of high school, she was 16, but she worked 3 years in the newspaper to get the money to go to school at the University of Nebraska. And when she got to the University of Nebraska, one of the first things she did was to go to the Daily Nebraskan and apply for a job. And the fellow that interviewed her was my dad, who was the editor of the Daily Nebraskan. Now, a few months later, after the first semester, my granddad lost his foreman, who bought a paper in Eustis, Nebraska himself, and so he called my mom and asked her if she'd come back to help out with the paper, which she did. So she took off a semester and then came back again to Nebraska, and a year or so later married my dad. But the fact that two sides of the family had a strong interest in the newspaper business, coupled with a stock market crash, I must admit, because my dad actually wanted to go into newspapering, but back in those days, and he had an offer from Greg McBride, I think it was, at a telephone someplace at the house where McBride told him to make up his mind. And my dad was a blind editor in a small town Nebraska he was going to go to work for, but he had that idea at the time, which is long passed out of favor, that he would let his father, who had paid for his education, call the shots on his first job. And my grandfather on that side had different ideas. So came to Omaha, became a stock salesman, and I was born in 1930, but I was conceived right around November 30th, 1929. Those of you who have put together what it would be like selling stocks in the fall of 1929, in my conception will understand what happened. So that's the story of how I got here. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to figure out how to avoid having the media end my life. And I guess that's the subject of our seminar this evening. And I think the best way to do this is just throw it open for questions. I've been around newspapers a long time. I worked for the Lincoln Journal in college. I delivered 5 newspaper routes when I was in Washington. I had 0.2% of all the Washington Post circulation in 1944. And I had this marvelous system because I delivered both the Post and its competitor, the Times Herald. So when my service was a little sloppy and people changed papers, they found my smiling face there. There was a publisher in Alabama many years ago that said he owed his prosperity to 2 fine American institutions, monopoly and nepotism. I guess back when I was building those papers, I figured out the monopoly aspect of it anyway.
For those of us on the other side of the table, we get barraged with information, and I'm wondering how do you just read annuals, 10Ks, and talk to people and ignore everything else, and how do you keep track of everything intellectually?
Well, we don't keep track of everything, but the beauty of, to some extent, of evaluating businesses, large businesses, is that it is all cumulative. I mean, if you started doing it 40 or so years ago, you really have got a working knowledge of an awful lot of businesses, but there aren't that many to start with that are, and you can get a fix. What are there, 75 maybe or so important industries, and you'll get to understand how they operate, and you don't have to start over again every day. And you don't have to consult a computer for it or anything like that. So it has the advantage of accumulation of useful information over time, and you just add the incremental bit at some point. Why did we decide to buy Coca-Cola in 1988? Well, it may have been just a couple small incremental bits of information, but that came into a mass that had been accumulated over decades, and it's a great business that way. It's why we like businesses that don't change too much, because the past is useful to us. Charlie?
I can't add a thing to that.
My name is Stanley Watkins, and from Manhattan, Kansas, and I'm a shareholder. And I have 2 questions, and the first one I know the answer, so you can just say yes or no. Would you consider investing in indexes such as OEX pure speculation? You're going to say yes. And number 2, would you encourage investors to, if they were trying to get a lot of their investment, to use leaps on investments such as Coca-Cola instead of buying the stock?
Use what on? I missed that.
Leaps.
Leak?
Leaps.
Leaps.
Oh, I see. We're still on options. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Both the questions relate to futures of one sort, calls or whatever they may be, and I think that investors should stick to buying ownership in businesses. It's not that you can't come up with a theoretical argument for buying, say, I mean, if you think Coca-Cola is attractive, you can say, well, I'd rather buy a 5-year option on Coke than buy the stock directly because it introduces leverage without the risk of going broke. But I think that that's a dangerous path to start down because if it works well, it's dynamite to start playing with things that can expire and become worthless or can be bought with very low margin as the OAX options you were talking about. Borrowed money usually or frequently leads to trouble, and it's not necessary. I mean, if you had some compelling reason, if you had to double your money by the end of the year and be shot, then I would head for the futures market because you need to do it. I mean, you have to introduce borrowed money, but you really ought to figure out how you can be happy with the present amount of money you've got, and then figure that everything else is all to the good as you go along. I don't think people, once they start focusing on short-term price behavior, which is the nature of buying calls or leaps or speculating in index futures, once you start concentrating on that, I think you're very likely to take your eye off the main ball, which is just valuing businesses. So I don't recommend it. Yeah, it's certainly true. If we'd operated Berkshire with considerable borrowed money over the years, it would have done very much better than it has. But nobody knew what that amount of borrowed money would have, the appropriate level would have been, and it wouldn't have made any difference to us. I mean, we have just as much fun doing what we've done than if we'd owned it on leverage and it had been twice as much. I mean, it's not the way we approach it. If you have X and you think you're going to be way happier when you've got 2X, it's probably not true. You really ought to enjoy where you are at the point, and if you can make 12 or 15% a year and you desire to save and you like piling it up, it'll all come in time. And why risk losing what you need, and have for what you don't need and don't have? It's never made a lot of sense to us.
Could you share your thinking about how much debt you would consider taking on to buy great businesses as cheap in that kind of a situation?
Well, if we had both a big hurricane in the Northeast or in Florida, and we had a big quake in California in the same year, and we had a financial market, the financial markets tanked, perhaps because of those events, but perhaps for other reasons, we would be thinking about ways, it might not be borrowing money directly, but we would be thinking about ways to buy securities if they got cheap enough. I mean, anytime securities get cheap, Charlie, you're thumping again here. Anytime securities get cheap, we don't like to go to the office and not write a ticket. I mean, we certainly would have the ability to borrow some money. We would never borrow a ton of money relative to capital. We're just not set out that way. We don't want to disappoint anybody in this world. We don't even want to worry about disappointing anybody in this world. So we're not going to do that. But we have a lot of extra firepower overall, and I would say under almost any conditions that cause securities to get very cheap, we would find a way to buy some of them.
I own another stock which sells for 4 times current trailing earnings. Every quarter we get a report. Earnings go up, sales go up, cash flow goes up, the equity base expands, they gain market share, and the stock goes down. The company has a 60% 5-year annualized growth rate and sells at 4 times earnings. I have 2 related questions. First, is this a growth stock or a value stock? And could you please give us your definitions of these terms? Second, the company sells recreational vehicles. Demographic trends in the recreation and leisure areas, RVs, cruise lines, golf equipment, etc., seem to be quite good. Do you see any opportunities for Berkshire here? Thanks.
Well, the question about growth and value is we've addressed in past annual reports, but they are not 2 distinct categories of business. Every business is worth the present. If you knew what it was going to be able to disgorge in cash between now and Judgment Day, you could come to a precise figure as to what it is worth today. Now, elements of that can be the ability to use additional capital at good rates. And most growth companies that are characterized as growth companies have that as a characteristic. But there is no distinction in our minds between growth and value. Every business we look at as being a value proposition. The potential for growth and the likelihood of good economics being attached to that growth are part of the equation in evaluation. But they're all value decisions. A company that pays no dividends, growing 100% a year, is losing money now. That's a value decision. You have to decide how much value you're going to get. Actually, it's very simple. The first investment primer, when would you guess it was written? The first investment primer that I know of, and it was pretty good advice, was delivered in about 600 BC by Aesop. And Aesop, you'll remember, said, "A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush." Now, incidentally, Aesop did not know it was 600 BC. He was smart, but he wasn't that smart. Now, Aesop was onto something, but he didn't finish it, because there's a couple of other questions that go along with that. But it is an investment equation. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. He forgot to say exactly when you were going to get the two from the bush, and he forgot to say what interest rates were that you had to measure this against. But if he'd given those two factors, he would have defined investment for the next 2,600 years, because a bird in the hand is, you will trade a bird in the hand, which is investing. You lay out cash today, and then the question is, as an investment decision, you have to evaluate how many birds are in the bush. You may think there are 2 birds in the bush or 3 birds in the bush, and you have to decide when they're going to come out and when you're going to acquire them. Now, if interest rates are 5%, and you're going to get 2 birds from the bush in 5 years, we'll say, versus 1 now, 2 birds in the bush are much better than a bird in the hand now. So you want to trade your bird in the hand and say, I'll take 2 birds in the bush, because if you're going to get them in 5 years, that's roughly 14% compounded annually, and interest rates are only 5%. But if interest rates were 20%, you would decline to take 2 birds in the bush 5 years from now. You would say that's not good enough, because at 20%, if I just keep this bird in my hand and compound it, I'll have more birds than 2 birds in the bush in 5 years. Now, what's all that got to do with growth? Well, usually growth people associate with a lot more birds in the bush, but you still have to decide when you're going to get them. And you have to measure that against interest rates, and you have to measure it against other bushes and other equations. And that's all investing is. It's a value decision based on, what it is worth, how many birds are in that bush, when you're going to get them, and what interest rates are. Now, if you pay $500 billion, and when we buy a stock, we always think in terms of buying the whole enterprise, because it enables us to think as businessmen rather than as stock speculators. So let's just take a company that has marvelous prospects, is paying you nothing now, and you buy it at a valuation of $500 billion. Now, if you feel that 10% is the appropriate rate of return, and you can pick your figure, that means that if it pays you nothing this year, but starts paying next year, it has to be able to pay you $55 billion in perpetuity each year. But if it's not going to pay until the 3rd year, then it has to pay you $60.5 billion in perpetuity to justify the present price. Every year that you wait to take a bird out of the bush means that you have to take out more birds. It's that simple. And I question in my mind whether people who pay $500 billion implicitly for a business by buying 10 shares of stock at some price are really thinking of the mathematics implicit in what they are doing. To deliver let's just assume there's only going to be a 1-year delay before the business starts paying out to you, and you want to get a 10% return, and you pay $500 billion. That means $55 billion of cash that they have to be able to disgorge to you year after year after year. To do that, they have to make perhaps $80 billion or close to it pre-tax. Now, you might look around at the universe of businesses in this world and see how many are earning $80 billion pre-tax, or 70, or 60, or 50, or 40, or 30, and you won't find any. So it requires a rather extraordinary change in profitability to give you enough birds out of that particular bush to make it worthwhile to give up the one that you have in your hand. Second part of your question about whether we'd be willing to buy a wonderful business at 4 times earnings, I think I could get even Charlie interested in that. So.